You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Planning a wedding shouldn't feel overwhelming. The Knot brings everything together in one place. Vendors who get your vibe, a custom planning checklist, guest list tools, and a free wedding website that syncs with it all. So instead of juggling a dozen apps and spreadsheets, you can actually enjoy getting married. Get started at theknot.com/audio. The Knot. Let's plan your wedding together.
So good, so good, so good.
Spring styles are at Nordstrom Rack stores now, and they're up to 60% off. Stock up and save on Rag & Bone, Madewell, Vince, All Saints, and more of your favorites.
How did I not know Rack has Adidas?
Why do we rack? For the hottest deals. There's so many good brands.
Join the Nordy Club to unlock exclusive discounts, shop new arrivals first, and more. Plus, buy online and pick up at your favorite Rack store for free. Great brands, great prices. That's why you rack.
This episode is brought to you by our Patreon members. Thank you so much.
Join our Patreon for extra episodes, interviews, extra content, and to help support the podcast and help us continue to do the work we do.
Go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl to learn more. He who is the Lord of War ought to be appeased by the shedding of human blood. I'm Jenny Williamson.
And I'm Jen McMenemy.
And this is Ancient History Fangirl. So, in our last episode about Amalasuintha and the end of the Ostrogothic Kingdom, we said we were next going to turn to the Visigothic Kingdom, which was over on the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day France and Spain, and tell you the story of that kingdom, but actually, we're not.
Nope, we have to take a little bit of a detour because to understand that kingdom, we have to understand some other things first.
I was going to go and put them back to back, but Jen was like, you know what, Jenny, I feel like before we get into the Visigothic Kingdom, you've got to explain the religion to me because that is a big part of this story. So I'm like, okay, I guess we'll do that. So that's what we're doing. The religion in question was Christianity, and of course there's a lot to say about Christianity and the Goths because they were one of the earliest Germanic groups that converted to Christianity. But before I can talk about the Christianity, I want to talk about the paganism that came before it because we know so little about it, but that would have also been a factor in how they saw the world and how that colored their relationship to Christianity, how it colored their relationship to the Roman Empire and things like that. So I felt like it was important to do both. So that's what we're here today to do. The story of the Visigothic Kingdom can't be told without knowing a little more about the history of Gothic religion. A glimpse of this comes through with the Ostrogoths. Theirs was a kingdom fiercely divided between the Roman Catholics and the Arian Goths. They were both Christians, but there were a lot of divides.
Yeah, these two groups had to follow very different laws. And even though Theodoric was known generally as a more religiously tolerant leader than some of the others, the Catholics in his realm eventually got so mad at him that when he died, they were openly fantasizing about him getting hurled into volcanoes and dragged into hell by demonic horses or kelpies.
Yeah, if Jen's telling the story, it's kelpies.
Always. I'm always adding a kelpie in.
I'm just clarifying that in the ancient sources it is horses, but it could be kelpies, sure.
So, just like the Loch Ness Monster is the Pictish Beast. True fact.
Documented elephant. I'm sorry.
It is not. So, it turns out the Visigoths were also viciously divided between Arian and Catholic Christianity. And to talk about that divide, we have to know a little more about the religions and how the ancient pagan religion contributed to Gothic culture.
And of course, because this is the Goths and nothing is simple, before I go into the Christianity of it all, I want to talk about the pre-Roman religion of the Goths because that might also turn out to be relevant here. The Goths were Christianized very early on in their recorded history, by the early 300s AD. That's the earliest Christianization of any Germanic group, as far as I know. Their pre-Christian pagan religion is hard to find any information about because of several factors. First, how early they were Christianized. The Goths only show up in Roman sources in the 200s AD, and as we've seen from exploring that history, those records are both extremely fragmentary and written from Roman sources mainly concerned with military actions. They were not interested in the religions that these groups had, and even if they were, half the time they equated the Goths with other groups, lumping them all together as Scythians. Precision was not their strong suit at this point.
The Romans treating everyone who's not Romans as if they're the same and barbarians, it never happened. Lies.
Never, never.
Second, the Goths' religion was like a lot of other ancient pagan religions of the time, closed to outsiders. They didn't have a gospel for everyone to read. They probably didn't have anything written down. They did not proselytize. The religion was a mystery cult, a repository of sacred knowledge only for the initiated.
Third, to say there was a Gothic pagan religion, singular, may be a bit of a misnomer. There were lots of different Goths. Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Crimean Goths, Thracian Goths, Pannonian Goths, the list goes on. And no doubt religious traditions varied among these groups, and probably within these groups, maybe even from village to village.
And finally, fourth, so many books and articles on quote-unquote Germanic religion mainly focus on Northern Germanic religions, i.e. Viking religion, which we know about from heavily Christianized sources that were Christianized at a different time, from a different type of Christianity, about 1,000 years after the fact. And to be fair, it's quite possible that there's some continuity between some Northern and Eastern Germanic practices, given the possibility that the Goths may have originated in Scandinavia. It's intriguing to think that those similarities point to a common origin before the Goths emigrated, suggesting these are very old beliefs indeed. Or the beliefs could have been transmitted either east to west or west to east through cultural exchange.
But I did still find it important to try to separate what we know is Viking versus what we know or don't know or think is Gothic, because it's too easy to fall into the trap of Goths just being proto-Vikings. Like, that is a super easy shortcut to take. That Viking information is there, waiting to fill any gaps that occur, and the gaps are vast, and I would say that they kind of limit our ability to understand in some ways. So there's this book that I used as a source. Hans-Peter Hasenfratz, author of Barbarian Rites, The Spiritual World of the Vikings and the Germanic Tribes, describes the problem well. Quote, "There is the religion of those who spoke North Germanic languages, that's the Vikings, for which we have the most detailed, coherent group of written sources. There is the religion of those who spoke South Germanic, that is, West Germanic languages, for which the sources are generally more sparse and more disparate. And then there is the religion of those who spoke Eastern Germanic languages, that's the Goths, about which we factually know nothing." So we really just don't know much, if anything, about Gothic pagan religion.
But how are we going to make a whole episode out of that, Jenny?
Well, you know, that's the magic of me being awesome. It may shock you to hear that much of what I'm going to tell you is questionable in various ways, but I'm trying to triangulate here and create a general picture.
Fair. So, nothing might not be exactly right? We do know some things. Some of it is gleaned from early Christian accounts of clashes between Christian and pagan Gothic culture at the beginning of the Goths' Christianization. There are also clues in the archaeology of the pre-Roman Goths, including fragmentary Futhark inscriptions. And we can find some clues in both Roman accounts and in Viking and Icelandic sagas, although all these sources are problematic for various reasons.
We also have Tacitus.
Oh boy, do we ever.
Do we ever have Tacitus? And I spent a whole episode early on in this series talking about how problematic Tacitus is. He is a questionable source for many reasons, which we explored in that episode on Gothic culture. I think it was like the second one that dropped in this series. But some things he says do crop up in later sources about the Goths' traditions and behavior, and I always find it interesting when I find something that harkens back to that. So, just to give ourselves that basis, here is a roundup of things Tacitus has said about Germanic religion in general, which may or may not apply to the Goths. Quote, "They have a tradition that Hercules also has been in their country, and him above all other heroes they extol in their songs when they advance to battle. Amongst them, too, are found that kind of verses by the recital of which, by them called barding, they inspire bravery. Nay, by such chanting itself they divine the success of the approaching fight. For, according to the different din of the battle, they urge furiously or shrink timorously. Nor does what they utter so much seem to be singing as the voice and exertion of valor. They chiefly study a tone fierce and harsh, with a broken and unequal murmur, and therefore apply their shields to their mouths, whence the voice may by rebounding swell with greater fullness and force." I just find that so fascinating. Like there was this specific battle song tradition that must have been extremely like just brutal and visceral and just quite the thing to hear on a battlefield, you know?
Yeah, and I think it's really important. Like, it always seemed weird to me when we talked about, like, battle music and battle songs. But, like, you have to remember that the way in which they probably, like, we talked about this when we talked about the ancient Carnaxes. Am I saying that right?
The Carnaxes.
The Carnaxes.
That's in Celtic archaeology and history, too. The Celts also had this battlefield music tradition, and you can see it when you study the Morrigan. Her battlefield magic is specifically about songs and poetry, you know? Like, she's really using that battlefield magical song tradition to enact things on the battlefield in favor of her side.
And I think why I wanted to bring this up is, like I said, a lot of times you think like battle music, battle songs sounds like an odd thing, but you have to remember, I think we talked about this also with Barry Strauss, like, during the battle, in order to communicate with your side, you'd have the Romans blaring their horns, the Carnaxes on the Celtic side, and here we're talking about battle songs, this thunderous cacophony. These also gave people coded messages for where to go, where their side was, and what was going on. There is a deep importance to music during battle.
Absolutely. I mean, historians have discussed and debated long and hard for centuries about how ancient cultures communicated on the battlefield. And some of it is music. Like, you have these horns, like the Romans had horns. And like, I think this still happens now, you know, like in more modern times, there's like drummers and people with trumpets and things like that. And it happened back then. And I think to cultures like the Celts and the Goths and Germanic tribes more generally, the music would have been seen as sort of like a battlefield magic, as a way to intimidate the enemy and as a way to communicate with each other. I think it could serve all those purposes.
Yeah, and I think, like, to me, it's always, like, important to remind myself that there's this real purpose for this music, you know?
So you'll notice that in this paragraph, Tacitus mentions Hercules as somebody that they worship. I think it's unlikely that the Germanic people that he's writing about actually worshipped Hercules or Heracles, depending on, you know, whether the source is Greek or Roman. This is a Roman source. I'm going to say Hercules. It's probably, you know, a war god that Tacitus is equating to Hercules. You know, Roman chroniclers, and I believe also Greek chroniclers, kind of like did this a lot, you know, where they would say like, oh, the god that they worship is Mars. And really, they had a war god, but they didn't call him Mars.
I will say one of the things about Hercules is that he was said to have had many, 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 many children throughout the world. So it's also leading into this idea that, like, so many people are descended from Hercules. But I agree with you. I don't actually think that's the case. I think this is probably something else. So here's another thing Tacitus says, quote, "Of all the gods, Mercury is he whom they worship most. To him on certain days it is lawful to offer even human victims. Hercules and Mars they appease with beasts usually allowed for sacrifice. From the grandeur and majesty of beings celestial, they judge it altogether unsuitable to hold the gods enclosed within walls, or to represent them under any human likeness. They consecrate whole woods and groves, and by the names of the gods they call these recesses, divinities these, which only in contemplation and mental reverence they behold." So it really means something that Tacitus and other ancient Romans equated Germanic gods with Mercury, Hercules, and Mars. But also note that the Germanic people seem to have sacred groves, again like the Celts, and that both animal and human sacrifices appear to have been a thing. And I will say this interesting thing about Mercury. Mercury, or Hermes, is a god of commerce. He's a god of travelers and trade and tricksters. And he's also like a psychopomp, one of the gods who lead you between this realm and the next realm. He's a really complicated and fascinating god. He's also a trickster god. So I think it's interesting that we see them sort of equating this here. Again, I don't think this god was anything like Mercury. I think it was their own thing. But it's interesting how they talk about it.
Well, there are some interesting parallels between Mercury and Odin, the god of travelers and the trickster god, you know, and I've seen some scholars suggest that this could have been, you know, a proto-Odin that the Romans are equating with Mercury because of these certain qualities.
When you want your spring break to feel like... and your kids' pool day to feel like... and your hotel bed to feel like... ooh, and room service to feel like... because at Hilton, hospitality feels like...
Your cabana's ready. Would you like fresh towels?
It matters where you stay. Book now at Hilton.com. Hilton, for the stay.
Just the tips.
Just the tips?
Stops those split ends, lickety-split. Look at those ends, they are amending.
Now that's what I call a happy ending.
Red Kit ABC Hair Bandage Balm.
USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Tap the banner to learn more and get a quote at USAA.com/bundle. Restrictions apply.
So here's another quote from Tacitus. Quote, "To the use of lots and auguries they are addicted beyond all other nations. Their method of divining by lots is exceeding simple. From a tree which bears fruit they cut a twig and divide it into 2 small pieces. These they distinguish by so many several marks, and throw them at random and without order upon a white garment. Then the priest of the community, if for the public the lots are consulted, or the father of a family, if about a private concern, after he has solemnly invoked the gods, with eyes lifted up to heaven, takes up every piece thrice, and having done thus forms a judgment according to the marks before made. Yea, there also is the known practice of divining events from the voices and flights of birds." So we have this tradition of runic magic, which I'm going to get into in more detail, but there's also other methods of divination, which allow me to tell you about those first, from Tacitus. Quote, we go on, "Yea, here also is the known practice of divining events from the voices and flight of birds," which is definitely a very Roman thing.
I was going to say the same thing. This is so Roman. The birds definitely, but I would say the runic magic isn't so different from what we see in like curse tablets and things like that.
Sigildry, which we'll get into. Anyway, but let me keep going on this augury situation first. Quote from Tacitus, continuing on, "But to this nation it is peculiar to learn presages and admonitions divine from horses also. These are nourished by the state in the same sacred woods and groves, all milk white, and employed in no earthly labor. These yoked in the holy chariot are accompanied by the priest and the king, or the chief of the community, who both carefully observed his actions and neighing. Nor in any sort of augury is more faith and assurance reposed, not by the populace only, but even by the nobles, even by the priests. These account themselves the ministers of the gods, and the horses privy to his will." I like that they don't kill the horses. That's good. They have likewise another method of divination, whence to learn the issue of great and mighty wars. From the nation with whom they are at war they contrive to gain a captive. Him they engage in combat with one selected from amongst themselves, each armed after the manner of his country, and according as the victory falls to this or the other, to gather a presage of the whole. So let's unpack this a little bit. So according to Tacitus, the Germanic people have a method of, they have these augury traditions that strike me as pretty similar to things that the Romans did. I would love to do an episode at some point on ancient Roman divination and magic and auguries like this, because we see this stuff pop up sometimes in things like chroniclers talking about signs and things, and I just find it really strange and fascinating.
It's so weird and superstitious, and we've talked about it a few times. I love how it still comes down into modern culture. There are so many weird superstitions that I've unpacked throughout my life, including eating lentils on New Year's Eve or New Year's Day. That literally comes from ancient Rome that's been carried on through the Italian tradition. It's wild.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they actually fought to the death, but potentially it's a form of human sacrifice through gladiatorial combat with this captive, to determine if the war that they're about to fight they're going to win or not. And also, there's the runic sticks, and I want to talk a little more about that. So according to Tacitus, the Germanic people have a method of divining by, tossing sticks that they've carved runes onto a sheet of linen and then interpreting what the runes say. This is a very old method of divining, although the oldest rune sticks ever discovered seem to be from around the 1200s or 1300s in Scandinavia. And these were written in Younger Futhark, which is a type of rune that evolved from Elder Futhark, which is potentially the type that the Goths may have used.
Yeah, and if you'll remember, there have been some artifacts discovered with runic writing called Elder Futhark that the Goths may have used in Gothic territory, mostly dating to the 1st or 2nd centuries AD. The oldest inscriptions in Elder Futhark were found in what we might call Gothic territory, from southeastern Poland as far south as the Carpathian Mountains in Romania. They appeared on artifacts like belt buckles, brooches, and weapons, and seemed to disappear around when the Goths were Christianized.
So there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that these were Gothic items. I don't think that's necessarily 100% known, but that's the circumstantial thought.
If there were any runic sticks being used for divination in this area during this time, none have been found that we've heard of in our research. And that doesn't mean they don't exist or that runes on other artifacts didn't have some kind of magical or religious purpose.
So one of those magical or religious purposes might have been Sigaldric magic. We mentioned this in some of our previous episodes on Gothic archaeology and culture, and here I want to go into it in more detail. Sigaldric magic involves writing special runic inscriptions on an object to impart certain qualities onto that object. For instance, a spear found in Gothic territory, this is a real artifact, had the inscription Target Writer or Sure Hitter in Elder Futhark, which could have been, the name of the spear. They might have given it this cool name, or it could have been part of a spell to, improve the aim of the weapon.
Or the person throwing the weapon.
They're trying to make it the gay Bolga, right? The spear that doesn't miss. So in his book, Barbarian Rites, The Spiritual World of the Vikings and the Germanic Tribes, Dr. Hans-Peter Hassenfratz explains how runic magic works, and I just find this so fascinating. Quote, a fundamental assumption of magic is that the spoken word itself has innate power to evoke and produce what it expresses. Exactly for this reason, the correct word must be uttered. A slip of the tongue ruins the magical effect or directs the effect back against the one who has misspoken. So you cannot mess up. Formulaic types of speech and singing strengthen the magical power of the word. The written word is more effective than the spoken one. It does not need to be continually repeated because it stands as written. So you don't have to repeat the spell over and over again. You can just write it down and then it continues to repeat and exist in the world. It is nevertheless also more susceptible to contingencies. The written charm can be erased or scraped off by the person for whom it is intended or by another person, thus depriving it of its magical power. It's more vulnerable. To prevent it from being read and understood by the wrong recipient, and thus rendered ineffective, the author of the charm may have to encipher it, that is, arrange initial letters to stand for a word, creating an acrostic, or scramble the letters of a word, creating an anagram, or arrange them in such a way that only the author knows its true meaning and magical effect, while the charm is inaccessible to those for whom it is not intended. As the color of life, red confers the letters, and thus the written word, with heightened magical power. So isn't that fascinating, this description of magical incantations and how they work? So let's zero in on that last sentence where he mentions the color red. Hassenfratz traces the modern German word for magic, which is, I'm sorry I don't speak German, this is probably going to come out wrong, Zauber, which comes from an old High German word, Zobar. This can be traced back to an Old English word, T4. Again, I may be mispronouncing all of this, which meant, quote, red coloring, ochre, red chalk, or ointment. So the word magic in German is connected to older words for red coloring, ochre, red chalk, and that kind of stuff. So it implies that these are connected. This in turn goes back to a Proto-Western Germanic word, Tauber. Hassenfratz suggests that this is a clue that people who used runic magic stained the runes with blood to make them work originally. Other substances, such as ochre and red chalk, were used to replicate blood.
Essentially, if you want this magic to work, you got to give us a little bit of your blood or someone's blood, which is super fascinating. And again, I don't think so different to what we see with other pagan cultures at this time in different places, right?
You do see Sigaldric magic also has a place in, Roman magic, like you were mentioning curse tablets. I think that's one way of finding it. You find this in ancient Egypt too. Lots of different artifacts that have ochre on them have been discovered in the archaeological record. And is it possible that these were magical items that were given this sort of ochre coloring to activate a spell? Some of them maybe, we don't know, but it's an intriguing possibility, right?
It is. And I just keep reminding, because I feel like sometimes, particularly with Tacitus and other sources, there is this othering going on of these cultures. But if we look at what they were doing in similar places, it's not that different.
Yeah, and it interests me so much that possibly even going back to cave paintings where they used ochre to color things. Were they attracted to that color because it was a stand-in for blood, which gave this hunting magic of this painting they were creating on this wall in a cave, gave it magical properties of supporting and sustaining the hunt? I don't know, but it's really cool to think about.
Seriously cool. So We now have some evidence that the Germanic people used runes for magical purposes, and Tacitus describes their ritual castings of sticks carved with runes to foretell the future, and some examples have been found of old Futhark writing on Gothic artifacts that might have been Visigothic magic. But did the Goths have an ancient tradition of bloody rune magic? Again, this is still very hard to say definitively one way or another, and we might just be talking some fan fiction, but at least it's fan fiction that has some basis in fact.
Yeah, I will say that I don't believe any items with runic inscriptions have been discovered that could have credibly been Gothic that have ochre in them, for example. But again, if we know that that is how the magic worked, we could extrapolate that maybe it did happen. So, let's talk about Sabbath the Goth and the very important feasts, Jen. I'm bringing the Christianity into it because we have to talk about it at a certain point. So now we've gotten a sense of a religion that may have included augury, runic magic, human and animal sacrifice, and sigildry. And Jen points out, and I think this is really true, that a lot of this you can find in other religions as well, so it seems kind of general. This example that I'm going to give you is a lot more specific to the Goths, and I would say, maybe less general, but a lot more well documented. So my main source on this section is Herwig Wolfram's book, History of the Goths. I like this source because it's not about Germanic or Viking religion more broadly, but about the Goths specifically, coming from ancient archaeological discoveries, Christian and Roman accounts, and some very specific things from Viking sagas. And I like this because I don't have to do the work of guessing what is and isn't Gothic versus Viking or just Germanic generally, because he's already done it. That's great. Okay, so Wolfram starts his chapter on pre-Christian Gothic religion by describing an ancient account of a sacrificial meal in a Gothic community, where the meat would have been sacrificed to a Gothic god and would be eaten by everyone in the village. This meal carried a lot of significance. Quote from Wolfram, "Whoever excluded himself from that meal broke his religious ties to the community." And that person was also seen to be questioning the power of the local Reichs, or king or chieftain, which was grounds for banishment, at least as this story depicts it.
Where he's getting this from is the story of Sabbath the Goth, the hagiographical story of the life of a Gothic saint from around the time the Goths were becoming Christianized. This story is really important because it shows us a glimpse at cultural schisms and cultural cooperation between pagan and Christian communities around the time the Goths were becoming Christian. Sabbath was a young man living in what is now Romania in the later 300s AD. He had converted to Christianity at a time when his king, Athanaric, the king of the Trevengi, was a pagan and violently opposed to this new religion. According to Sabbath's hagiography, he refused to eat meat that had been sacrificed to the Gothic gods on several different occasions. For this sin, he was tortured and eventually drowned in 372 AD, about 4 years before the Trevengi went over the Danube and wound up in the starving camps. And this is a story that Jenny promises she's going to tell us all about in another episode. But for now, we're just giving you the broad strokes.
Yeah, I'm going to go a lot more in depth into this story when we get to the Christianity episode, which so far, as of this recording, is next, unless we change our minds. Anyway, Wolfram explains what it meant that Sabbath refused this sacrificial meat. Quote, "The denial of the tribal tradition necessarily threatened the upper stratum of Reichs, the kings or chieftains, who saw themselves as the bearers of the ethnic traditions which they tried to monopolize. The political importance of the leading stratum rested on its social prestige. From its midst had come the heroes whose deeds the people celebrated in songs and sagas, thus accepting and legitimizing the rule of the aristocracy." So the thing he appears to be saying here is that the religion, as this was a religious pagan feast, that's why Sabbath had to refuse this meat, seemed to bolster the legitimacy of the Gothic ruling classes by perpetuating these stories about great men who did great deeds.
Not great men and great deeds again.
I know, they keep coming up. There's so many great men doing so many great deeds. How do you keep track of them all? This is why we have Jordanes. Anyway, these great men who did great deeds were both mythological ancestors from way back, potentially sometimes gods. You could sort of usher them all into one Amal family line if you have somebody you need to prop up. And they were also specifically rulers that the Goths knew today, from the most distant king like Athanaric, right down to the community level, the guy who's like the head chieftain of your village.
And by refusing the sacrificed food, Sabas was challenging his king's position and the position of his family and all the great men who arose from his lineage, and maybe even the position of the gods. And that really seems like a lot of pressure to me.
It sounds like a lot of pressure to go to this dinner party, right? Like, it's just like, no, you cannot skip it. I don't care if you have nothing to wear.
Yeah, it feels really high stakes. One thing Wolfram notes is that another Christian priest, Censalis, who also refused this sacrificial meat, was not punished, probably because he wasn't Gothic, and thus the expectation to eat the meat wasn't the same. Yeah, they're acknowledging that culturally he's different, so he's not turning their back on their culture, essentially. So, the idea that the pagan Gothic religion was tied to the kings and their lineage does track with the Goths, as sometimes their kings are described as priest kings, who had authority over lawmaking by augury and things of that nature. Rulership and religion went hand in hand with a lot of these ancient communities.
So some scholars have pointed out that as the Goths settled by the Black Sea around the 100s to 200s AD, theoretically, they were not a heterogeneous population. Other peoples would have been picked up in their migration and joined them. Thus, who a Goth was at this time may have involved not so much your ethnicity as your willingness to live under the rule of the Gothic Reichs, and no doubt his religion and ruling dynasty, and to worship all the men who did great deeds and all that stuff. So as a Goth, like Sabas, if you repudiated the religion by not eating the sacrificial meat, and by inference the king, you were basically saying you weren't a Goth anymore.
Yeah, you were turning in your Goth card and renouncing your culture and your country and your people.
God, so much pressure about this one dinner party.
This is Jen.
And Jenny.
From Ancient History Fangirl, and we're here to tell you about my co-host Jenny's scorching historical romantasy, Enemy of My Dreams.
In the last days of the Roman Empire, a desperate princess and a brutal Gothic warlord forge a dangerous alliance. Julia, only daughter of the Emperor of Rome, lives a life of excess and freedom. But when her father dies and her teenage brother takes the throne, he will stop at nothing to seize control of both the empire and his wayward sister. And now, Alaric of the Visigoths, a ferocious warrior who has battled Rome for years, has come to the capital to bargain for his homeland.
Realizing how perilous her position is, Julia impulsively turns to Alaric, the Empire's sworn enemy and the one man who can make Rome tremble, in an edgy, sexy, cat-and-mouse game of attraction, defiance, and lust.
Best-selling author Elodie Harper says, quote, "This is a hugely entertaining Roman world romantasy with a hilarious heroine and smoldering hero whose adventures in love and war are set against the backdrop of the last dangerous days of an ancient empire. Enemy of My Dreams is available wherever books are sold."
Kayak gets my flight, hotel, and rental car right, so I can tune out travel advice that's just plain wrong.
Bro, Skycoin. Way better than points.
Never fly during a Scorpio full moon.
Just tell the manager you'll sue. Instant room upgrade.
Stop taking bad travel advice. Start comparing hundreds of sites with Kayak and get your trip right.
Bad advice? You talking to me?
Kayak. Got that right.
Start your day with Quaker Protein Instant Oatmeal. The Instant Oatmeal ready to help you tackle whatever your day brings. Like wrangling your toddler into their car seat. That was fun. Coaching your 6th graders soccer team. Go girls! And carrying all the groceries in one trip. Whew. Try Quaker Protein Instant Oatmeal, granola, and bars. Great taste and a good source of protein. Quaker. Bring out the good.
This episode is brought to you by White Claw Surge. Great podcast pick, friend. No surprises there. After all, you're all about finding the tastiest flavors out there, just like White Claw Surge. And with big, bold flavors to enjoy, like blood orange, blackberry, cranberry, and more, it's time to go all in on taste. Unleash the flavor. Unleash White Claw Surge. Please drink responsibly. Hard seltzer with flavors. 8% alcohol by volume. White Claw Seltzer Works, Chicago, Illinois.
So that tells us just how important pre-Christian Gothic religion was to these communities. It was so important to their identity. But what was that religion like? It seems to be male-focused if we take its preoccupation with rulership and great men who did great deeds literally, but there are other vague tidbits we pick up that include polytheism, nature worship, and specifically ancestor worship.
And again, the Romans also had ancestor worship.
Well, sure, like a lot of places did.
I know, I just feel like because so many of our sources here are Roman, it's like they were doing this too. It wasn't that different. The word ances, which means something like sacred ancestors, sometimes pops up in ancient sources about pre-Roman Gothic religion. It's related to the word Aesir, the Old Norse pantheon of gods. It's possible that this religious ancestor worship tradition is where the legendary affiliation for great men who did great deeds evolved from. Maybe. Interestingly, the English word God is associated to the Gothic word gup. And this word meant an idol, a carved wooden statue or object supposedly imbued with the spirit of a god. And this was, of course, anti-Christian and anti-Germanic pagan if you listen to Tacitus.
Yeah, because there's this whole section of Tacitus where he talks about how they don't use idols and they just use the trees and things like that.
However, in the Ulfilas Bible, and this was a Bible written in Gothic in the 300s AD, Ulfilas uses the word gup to mean God, which we also find fascinating, that his Gothic audience would have been picturing a wooden idol of some kind when imagining the Christian God.
Which they definitely wouldn't have wanted. Like, the Christians were not... They were very specific about non-idol worship, right? Isn't that a thing in Christianity?
Yeah, it is. But I'm just thinking, like, we just had Easter, and like throughout Easter, you have the Passion Parades where, essentially you reenact the Stations of the Cross. Sometimes somebody carries a cross. That's a piece of wood that is kind of a stand-in for quite a massive thing. And, there are also different parades in different countries and cities where you do see people carrying around, idols of the Virgin Mary and stuff throughout the streets. So I don't know how far removed it is. I'm not saying it's the same kind of worship, but there is a reverence for these items.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I also think about statues of the Virgin Mary that theoretically weep blood, or Jesus on the cross, sometimes with stigmata. These are statues that are supposedly imbued with the spirit of this holiness, potentially even bleeding from the same wounds Jesus had. Like, that does seem like the same thing to me.
It's in a similar family, right? Like, there's a lot of Christian things like relics from saints and, as we said, different statues and stuff that have a sacred and holy important significance to them. We're not a million miles away, but I don't want to generalize or oversimplify to different religions.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting to think that these Christian practices maybe had pagan roots of worshiping statues and believing the statues were like holy. So from the story of Sabas the Goth, we also have a glimpse of the importance of idols to pre-Christian Gothic religion. So the story mentions Winguric, another Tervingi prince from the time of Athanaric, who paraded a wooden statue on a chariot through his community. And this was a statue of a Gothic god, a pagan god. In Hans Peter Hassenfratz's book, Barbarian Rites, The Spiritual World of the Vikings and the Germanic Tribes, the author confirms this by quoting Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a traveler and chronicler from Baghdad, who accompanied an Arabic diplomatic mission to the Volga in the 1000s AD. So this is obviously much later and in a different place, but he tells about how the Rus, Vikings living in Russia from around the 700s to 1000s AD, worshipped, quote, a long upright piece of wood that had a face like a man's and is surrounded by little figures, idols, behind which are long stakes in the ground. Of course, as I said, the Rus were very removed from the Goths in both geography and time, but it's interesting to see these parallels with Gothic culture, and it kind of gives you like a context to imagine it in. Ahmad ibn Fadlan tells of people sacrificing food and goods to these idols. Quote, he takes a certain number of sheep or cattle and slaughters them, gives part of the meat as alms, brings the rest and deposits it before the great idol and the little idols around it, and suspends the heads of the cattle or sheep on the stakes. In the night, dogs come and eat everything, but the Rus who has made the offering says, truly, my Lord is content with me and has consumed the present I brought him. So what do you think of this, Jen?
The first thing I thought was, this sounds so much to me like what I saw in researching the statue of Artemis at the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Like, this seems to be something they did with this piece of wood, right? This ancient god-imbued piece of wood that became sacred and an idol.
The thing that I thought about was the Shigar idol, We did a whole episode on it for our Patreon. It is like a 12-foot high, or, very, maybe taller than that, very tall plank of wood that has been carved with all these very spooky images that was preserved in a peat bog in, I think, Siberia or somewhere for tens of thousands of years, for millennia. It dates from like the 11,000s BC, like right around the Ice Age, So people have been imbuing pieces of wood with the spirits of gods, from the beginning. Like, this is a very old practice, and I think it's probably worldwide.
I think so too. And I think, like, to me, that's super important. And like Jenny said, there's super ancient statues that have been found. And, for me, again, I just did all that Artemis research, and, they decorated that piece of wood. That piece of wood was so sacred. It was this very ancient piece of wood.
It's also kind of interesting to point out here that a lot of this information that we're getting about the Goths and Germanic people more generally is quite general and broad, and would have been probably quite common across a large swath of different groups at the time. The auguries, the worshipping of wooden idols, different types of fortune telling. The runic inscriptions is probably a little more specific, but I know that happened in other places as well. There's a lot of things here that I feel like for the time probably would have been read as quite general.
Yeah, and also, we've talked about this before in problems with sources, particularly when we have Christian telling us stories. A lot of times what they're doing is trying to tell you something about another culture by equating it to something you already understand, hence like the Hercules and Mercury and, Jupiter. So it's possible that this was something slightly different that they were telling you was kind of like this other thing that you know about.
Yeah, so let's talk about sacrifice in Gothic paganism, human and non-human. It is clear that sacrifice was a huge part of Gothic religion as well. Again, this is also kind of a general item because so many religions back in the day included sacrifice, definitely animal sacrifice, sometimes sacrifice of objects, and more occasionally, but it definitely was a thing, human sacrifice. And the Goths were probably no exception. So we can see how sacrifice was such an important thing in Gothic religious culture in the Ulfilas Bible. So again, the Bible was written in Gothic in the 300s AD, around, I would say, like within the first few decades after the Goths were Christianized. It was really speaking, I would say, at least partially to a newly converted audience, or potentially a pagan Christian curious audience. I don't know how literate everybody would have been. This probably would have been read to people by a priest. They had to use words that people understood to equate Christian concepts with pagan concepts. And sometimes the translations were a little wonky. And that's where we can learn things about the paganism, like the Gothic paganism. There are parts of the Ulfilas Bible where the Gothic word for sacrifice was used to mean worship in the Christian sense. When a Christian would say worship, the Ulfilas Bible uses a word that means sacrifice. And sacrificer, or he who sacrifices, was used to mean priest. So this gives us a sense that there was no word and thus no concept for worship or priests to the Goths, to the pagan Goths, without the concept of sacrificing. Isn't that fascinating?
Really fascinating. Again, in Christianity, there's a lot about sacrificing. Not necessarily sacrificing things, but the things that you sacrifice of yourself for your God and your faith. I think it goes in a different direction.
Sacrificing in a more symbolic sense, you mean? Like sacrificing chocolate for Lent, or...
Yeah, exactly. Like this idea of the things that you give up for Lent, or like early Christianity, like you couldn't have meat on certain high holy days, or it used to be every Friday. Like there was all kinds of different things. There was different fasting that you did. So some people still do, like I don't want to generalize. Haven't been practicing in many years, but there's a lot of that kind of sacrificing and giving up of yourself. Like it's not about killing animals or humans. It's about you giving up something from yourself to show your God your worship. So were there human sacrifices is the big question. And we get a sort of vague sense that there may have been. Hasenfratz's book talks a lot about human sacrifice, with particular focus on enslaved girls and women being sacrificed when an important chieftain died. And that stuff is absolutely wild. I did not include it here, and I didn't want to go into too much detail about it because I'm really not sure how much it applies to the Goths specifically, just that there was some kind of a concept of sacrifice. Earlier, we told you about Tacitus's account of human sacrifice via this sort of gladiatorial combat to tell what side would win a war, which is potentially, if they were, fighting to the death, could have been a form of human sacrifice. And again, this may or may not have been related to the Goths. This is all a question. For one example specific to the Goths, a Gothic general named Radagasius, contemporary to Alaric, Jenny's Alaric, who invaded Rome in 405 to 406 AD. So in a time when most Goths were Arian Christian, Radagasius is one of the last Gothic pagans we hear about. He invaded Rome around the same time as Alaric, and when he did, a Roman priest named Erosius said that he wanted to sacrifice, quote, all of Rome. And maybe it was just the senators or the aristocracy, or, I don't know, the city just burning the whole thing to the ground. But he wanted to sacrifice it to his gods, and Erosius may have been just othering Radagasius and pagans in general. And St. Augustine claimed Radagasius saw such success because of all the human sacrifice he was doing to Jupiter, the Roman god. Interesting.
These accounts are also a little bit suspect because I think that they're probably just Roman Christians haranguing these Gothic invaders than they are actual anthropological accounts of their human sacrifice practices. Like, I think it's unlikely that these are accurate. It kind of tells me that perhaps the Goths had some kind of reputation for human sacrifice. Who knows how true that was, especially in this time.
So Jordanes tells us that the Goths made human sacrifices to Mars, and this is a quote. Quote, now Mars has always been worshipped by the Goths with cruel rites, and captives were slain as his victims. They thought that he who is the Lord of War ought to be appeased by the shedding of human blood. To him they devoted the first share of the spoil, and in his honor, arms stripped from the foe were suspended from trees. And they had more than all other races a deep spirit of religion, since the worship of this god seemed to be really bestowed upon their ancestor. So I just want to stop here for a minute, Jenny. Can you imagine what it would have been like going into Gothic territory, into one of these like sacred groves or forests where hanging from the tree were the arms, not the literal arms, but like the weapons of like the vanquished armies and invaders who tried to take on the kingdom? It would be so creepy.
Yeah. You know, I frequently think about that, and potentially it wouldn't have been that far off that there'd be actual severed limbs hanging from the trees, because he who is the Lord of War ought to be appeased by the shedding of human blood, you know? And obviously it wasn't, Mars that they worshipped so much as a war god of their own that they called their own thing. But this is what Jordanes, who is Gothic but also Romanized, feels a need to call their god Mars for some reason.
Because that's how he understands it, and this is the audience he's writing it for and how they'll understand it. It's really that simple.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think that Jordanes is writing for a Romanized Gothic audience that was so Romanized that they understood their own ancestral gods as Roman gods. That's kind of interesting to me in a way that I'm just like, it feels like there's a real grasping back to an ancient history of Gothic culture that was possibly already being lost and forgotten by this time. And that's why it had such cultural cachet.
Yeah, it's this interesting sort of like colonization of the gods and stuff by kind of using their stories to equate to other lost gods and stories. Like, it's super fascinating.
Yeah, it is interesting. And remember, when Jordanes is writing, he's writing during the time of Totila, who was the last Ostrogothic king, very embattled, and he lost the penultimate battle, and eventually the Ostrogothic kingdom was lost. After this battle, and potentially quite a bit beforehand, the Gothic language was disappearing in the peninsula. You can kind of feel, like, just in this one sentence calling their war god Mars, this sort of grasping back to a barely remembered past that's already slipping through their hands. Like, it's kind of sad. Yeah.
Yeah, it's already been lost. How these like Greek and Roman gods became so widespread and this kind of cultural shorthand, and how they're equated with older gods, and how it kind of says how lost these gods were because they're being equated to these other colonizing gods in a way.
Yeah. So let's talk about women in Gothic paganism for a minute. We don't know a lot. I'm going to give you what we do know. So another thing we get a sense of is that women may have played a role as seeresses and priestesses in Gothic culture. Most of what we know about this comes from other Germanic cultures. For example, Voleda of the Batavi. She was the virgin seeress who lived in the tower during the Batavi revolt. Jen, you remember that, right?
Vaguely, yes.
We covered it on the Patreon. That's where we got the one Batavi warrior from.
This is a very long time ago.
If I remember right, she was blind. I don't remember, but she was a Germanic seeress. Or there's also the tradition of the Vulva, who were sorceresses among the Vikings. Those were both very far from the Goths in space and time. For evidence pertaining specifically to the Goths, what we have is Jordanes' account of the Haliarune, The witches who bred with demons to give birth to the Huns. You all remember that? We talked about that a little more recently.
Yeah, because that's not problematic at all.
Right, exactly. And again, this suggests certainly a negative view of the Huns, which we talked about during that episode, but also a negative view of women with magical roles in their communities. But it also suggests the existence of quote-unquote witches, or women with magical skills of some kind. And remember, Jourdain's was a Christian, so of course he would describe women with magical skills as witches. But potentially that wasn't what they would have been in pagan times, right?
Or women with any kind of knowledge as witches. So far, what we know about Gothic pre-Christian religion is not that much.
What do you think about how much we know so far? Do you agree with that statement?
I do agree with that statement. I think it's really difficult, and it's something that we've come across so many different times when we've looked at different cultures, particularly like I think of all the work we did on our Women of Myth book, where you just don't have a clear lens or understanding because most of what we know was written down by outsiders trying to tell about this culture to their own culture in a way that they could make them understand. And a lot of times written down by Christian sources who had a real stake in demonizing and othering these cultures. So it's really tough.
Right.
We have a sense that the pre-Christian Gothic pagan religion probably venerated great men who did great deeds, possibly as a form of ancestor worship, but also to prop up and reinforce the existing rulers and ruling structures.
And you see Jourdain's doing it even though, he's Christian.
Yeah, exactly. And we can glean elements of polytheism, maybe a male-centric pantheon, the importance of idols, and women having potentially a seeress or priestess role in their own communities. Oh, and if you refuse to eat the sacred meat, you are dead to us. You know, Jenny, the more and more I thought about this, the more I thought about, the ancient laws of Zinnia and a lot of the other pagan festivals and festivals in general that were celebrated that were about sharing meat, sharing a communal meat source or drink source. We know during certain times, like winter solstice and stuff, everyone would get together. You would all eat food, drink wine, and you would plan out your year. You'd make all your important alliances and marriages. The idea that you aren't going to eat the meat or food of the person whose home you're staying in, it really sends a message that you don't trust them and that you don't consider them to be on your level, on your equal, or someone worth having some kind of relationship with. It's kind of shitty.
Yeah, well, we see it in Tacitus even. Tacitus talks a lot about the Germanic cultures and how they would all get together and get absolutely ripped and then make all their laws and, as you said, negotiate all their marriages and their treaties and make big communal decisions and things like that at these sacred meals. It goes beyond, are you going to eat the sacred meats or not? It's this communal experience of bonding where you're all eating the same food, which shows a certain amount of trust and conviviality and that you're all in this together. When we look at the myths of Cuchulainn in the Celts, Cuchulainn had this Gisa about not eating dog meat, but then somebody offered him dog meat and he had to eat the dog meat because he had this conflicting Gisa about saying no to hospitality, and that eventually led to his downfall, saying no to eating somebody's meats.
Yeah, it's really interesting too because you've got this sort of clash of Christianity and paganism where it's you've got these two cultures trying to exist at the same time, and one culture is saying please honor and respect the fact that this is something you need to do. You need to eat this meat and have this meal because this is how you tell us that you are friendly and that you are willing to make treaties with us and you're one of us, even in an honorary way. And you've got Christianity, which is saying, if I do that, I'm turning my back on my God, and that is absolutely anathema to me, so I cannot do that. So it really is this place where you got this clash of these two different faiths, and it kind of shows us how we wind up with different situations and problems down the line.
Yeah, and we are going to talk about Sabas the Goth and this thing with the meats in a lot more detail in the Christianity episode, because it just tells us so much about the state of these cultures and how they worked together and didn't work together, how that culture clash happened. It's super interesting.
Are you dreaming of the perfect prom, but there's just one thing holding you back?
Speak English, Mom.
Welcome to Ethnos Inc. Ethnic Modification.
What is this place?
We help you reach your true potential.
How are you feeling?
It's good to be white.
Hey, new girl.
Hey, look at what you've done to yourself.
For a new plant to grow, the seed has to die.
Slanted, rated R, only in theaters March 13th. Side effects may occur.
Welcome to Sephora. I'm looking for a perfume that's not too perfumey. I got you.
Serum moisturizer or moisturizer serum.
Let's get into layering.
My concealer is making me look worse.
Sounds like the wrong shade. Let's get you matched.
There's only one store that really gets what you're going for. Get beauty from people who get beauty. Only at Sephora.
Hi, Let's get you a basket.
Spring is here, and there's a whole new way to chai at Starbucks that's made perfect for you. Choose your sweetness, dial it up, or keep things light. Add a touch of pistachio, a hint of strawberry, or vanilla, or make it a spring classic with lavender. Because this season, there's endless ways to chai at Starbucks.
So a lot of this, though, I would say, the augury, the sacrificing, the meats and the hospitality, the worship of idols, wooden idols, like a lot of that, as we've said, is super generic, right? That would have been all true in different ways in lots of different cultures, including Roman cultures. So it's a little bit hard to parse, like how much of this is actually true, how much of this is a Roman writer equating something that they don't understand with something they do understand, like what can we glean from this? But there is something really interesting that does seem very Goth-specific, and it's the importance of oaths in Gothic culture. Not saying oaths aren't also important elsewhere, but just oaths seem to be playing a very specific role in certain Gothic stories that we hear. So, Herwig Wolfram describes the Gothic oath as a double-edged sword, both as a solemn promise backed up by fate and a terrible curse that would befall the swearer should he forsake the oath. And there are some examples of Gothic leaders swearing and forsaking oaths in the ancient sources. I'm giving you a roundup.
Yeah, let's go.
For instance, Athanaric, a pagan Gothic king who lived in the 300s AD, supposedly swore a terrible and dreadful oath to his father as a boy never to enter the Roman Empire on pains of something, I'm not sure what, but some terrible outcome if he did.
The Greek writer Eunapius, who lived from 347 to 420 AD, so he would have seen the Gothic refugee crisis, the Gothic War, and the sack of Rome, claimed that the Trevengi, who crossed the Danube in 376 AD, purposely broke oaths they'd sworn to Valens.
These same Trevengi, in despair over being continually gaslit and turned away and starved by the emperor, swore an oath to each other to never rest until they had destroyed the Roman Empire, or else.
Before the battle at the Willows during the Gothic War of 376 to 382 AD, the Trevengi were in such dire straits that they swore a sacred oath to come to each other's aid in battle.
Ostrogothic princes under Hunnic domination did not rebel against Attila when they could have because of oaths that they'd sworn to their Hunnic leaders.
Nonetheless, those same Ostrogothic princes, such as the three brothers, Valamir, Vidimir, and Theodemir, also swore oaths among themselves in secret, never to cooperate with their former oppressors if Attila died. So the role the oath seemed to play in Gothic culture is complicated. Again, there seemed to be a curse that would befall a swearer if they did not keep their oath. And oaths tended to be a tool of public life, sworn by leaders on behalf of whole communities rather than between two private citizens. Although you do get some kings, like the Ostrogoths under Hunnic domination, swearing private, secret oaths to each other. So, oaths appear to have played many roles.
I will say, though, that the secret oaths sworn by the three princes, those are also community oaths made on behalf of their followers as well as themselves. So they are kind of secret public oaths in a way. So let's talk about the names of gods. We don't actually have any names of any Gothic gods that we know for sure. Herwig Wolfram says, quote, "Whoever inquires about the names of Gothic gods will fare like an animal on a meager pasture. The demons lead you around in a circle. You sense the fertile pastures, but cannot find them." The Proto-Germanic word Wodenaz, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, meaning, quote, lord of frenzy or leader of the possessed, was the precursor to the Old English Woden, Old Saxon Uoden, Old Dutch Wodan, Old High German Wotan, Old Frisian Weda, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing all of those, I apologize, and of course, the Old Norse Odin.
Odin was a warrior poet associated with wisdom and healing, kingship, death, and the gallows, knowledge, war and battle, frenzy and the berserker state, sorcery, poetry, and the runic alphabet. We don't know if all or just some of that is carried over from Wodenaz. And we don't know if the Old Germanic Wodennes was a Gothic or just a Germanic god.
Yeah, there's definitely sort of a claim that I see made that Odin, the Viking god Odin, is related to Woden, who would have been an older Germanic god, when actually the word Woden is Old English, and there is a Proto-Germanic concept of that it may have evolved from, but we don't know really anything about that sort of Proto-Germanic god, except for what the word means, Lord of Frenzy or Leader of the Possessed, which does suggest that Berserker connection in particular, and we do talk about that in our Berserkers episode. Anyway, Wolfram highlights some Gothic names of gods that may have existed. So one of them is Teus, Teiws. I don't know how to say that, but I'm guessing on the pronunciation there. So it is attested that the Goths had a god of war. The Romans keep calling him Mars or Hercules or something like that. But it's more likely that the name would have been close to Teus. Like, this is something that the Goths would have called that god themselves. A rune in Elder Futhark pronounced Tiwaz or Tyr in Anglo-Saxon Futhorc was represented by an upward-pointing arrow interpreted as a spear. The name also appears in the name of the ancient tribe, the Tervingi. Herwig Wolfram draws a connection between that tribal name, the names Tyr or Teus or Tiwaz, and Turfing, which is a magical sword from the Turfing cycle, an Icelandic saga dating from the 1200s AD. This is super fascinating. So, I'm going to tell you about the Turfing cycle, Jen. This is obviously much later than the Goths, but it tells us something that might be applicable to the Goths, so I'm going to go down the rabbit hole briefly. Please indulge me. The Turfing cycle is its own rabbit hole. And in the story, the name Turfing is a magical sword that, according to the legend, had been cursed so that every time it was drawn, it had to kill someone. Legend said, quote, "It could never be unsheathed without being the death of a man, and it always had to be sheathed with blood still warm upon it." But the invincible sword sometimes missed its mark and killed the innocent, and the wielder himself or herself was not safe from its power. So it's like, oops, the hand slipped. The curse also said that the sword would be the cause of 3 great evils, which gives you a hint of how things go in this saga. What this reminds me of is the nature of the Gothic oath, a double-edged sword that bound the swearer with a terrible curse. I mean, this sword itself is a terrible curse in the story. It's almost like this sword, this like bloody, bloodthirsty sword, is like an embodiment of the Gothic oath. Like, that's what I'm seeing. Some scholars believe that the etymology of the word turfing seems to be connected to the tribal name Tervingi as well, and there are several other connections to Gothic history in this saga. For instance, the Goths appear in it specifically. They, like the sword, are called turfings. And there's a whole chapter called The Battle of the Goths and the Huns, which scholars debate about what battle this refers to or if it refers to any historical battle.
So, another theory is that the word turfing is a combination of the words tear and finger. It's literally what looks like finger. Tear and finger, which meant finger, actually, in Old Norse. You can translate this as the finger of the god of war. Since this was a sword that killed at a touch, it implies the existence of maybe a Gothic war god who could kill at a touch, like a death god, Jenny. Like, it's the Grim Reaper's pointing finger.
Exactly. Isn't that cool?
So metal.
So metal. I mean, look, the very small glimpses of Gothic gods that we're getting are extremely metal.
There's also Gapt or Gut, and this god appears as the original ancestor of the Amalai royal family in Jordanes' Getica. It's not that unusual for ruling families to claim descent from gods. We see it all the time. And the Amalai were no exception. There's some debate over whether this was a sort of all-father type god, or whether it was only worshipped by the Grithungi or served as a patron to them, or the Amalai, as some think only the Tervingi worship the Teus. And I just love this idea that, like, just one culture worshiped the death finger god.
If you think about it, it's like those gods that the Romans were calling, like, Mars and Hercules, those were like the death finger god Teus.
The death finger god.
And potentially Gopt or Got or Gut, as Jen pronounces it. It could be any of those, I don't know. Some have speculated that Gopt or Gut may have been an original ancestor, like originally a person from way back, deified due to ancestor worship and later identified with Odin. Interestingly, the Old Norse name Gotr was used as another name for Odin centuries later in Scandinavia, and in the Prose Edda, Odin is mentioned to have come from the Black Sea region, the ancestral home of the Goths. Coincidence? I think not. Here's another one. So there's a god named Fergunius, who is associated in one specific place with Jupiter. So the evidence for this one comes from Elder Futhark, specifically the Ring of Petroassa. This golden torque dates from 250 to 400 AD, and it was discovered in southeast Romania in the 1800s. At one point, it was hacked to pieces by a Bucharest goldsmith. There were 15 Elder Futhark runes on this torque, and they have been interpreted in many different ways. One way includes a mention of Jove or Jupiter.
And we provided some interpretations of these runes in our initial episode on Gothic archaeology that had to do with Gothic women.
So this is from Dr. Hasenfratz's book on Germanic and Viking magic.
Quote, sacred to the Gothic women, dedicated to the Gothic female warriors. But that's not the only way to interpret this. Dr. Hasenfratz warns us against resting too much on any one interpretation because of how variable they can be.
So these are different ways that the Ring of Petroassa has been interpreted, and this is what he has to say about it. Quote, someone who really wants to make sense of the Gothic runic inscription Gutanawolag. There's 15 runes, and they kind of all look like one word. Gutanawolag. Wohailag. It's a little bit difficult to figure out how all these letters go together. Anyway, it's from Bucharest, Petroassa in the 3rd century CE, may take their pick from the following scholarly interpretations. Quote, dedicated to the god Jupiter, Donar or Thor, of the Goths, sacrosanct. Or, quote, powerfully protected sacred object of the Gutania, tribal matrone of the Goths. Or, quote, ancestral property of the Goths, consecrated, holy. Or, ancestral property of the Goths, I am holy! Exclamation point. Anyway, so you can see how problematic it is relying on any one interpretation too heavily, especially when it comes to things like Elder Futhark. But some scholars have seen a mention of Jove or Jupiter in these runes. Herwig Wolfram says that if we believe that word, Jove or Jupiter, is carved on the torque, quote, the bracelet would carry a unique Latin runic inscription and the only evidence that the Goths also called their high god by the name Jupiter. He also suggests that perhaps St. Augustine wasn't wrong when claiming Radagasius was performing human sacrifices to Jupiter. All of this is quite interesting, and also very difficult to know for sure. Anyway, the name that comes up if you want to interpret this in Gothic is Fergunius, which is connected with a thunderer god and sometimes equated with Thor.
So the picture here is questionable. Herwig Wolfram suggests that the Trevengi and the Grithungi had different pantheons, with the Trevengi centering a war god named Tuaz Tyr, as the most important one, and the Grithungi worshipping an ancestor god named Gapt or Gut, and the Ostrogoths may have also worshipped a thunder god, a Jupiter, a Thor, or Fagunsis.
What I like about this section is that it is more specific to the Goths, and it's not just like, well, they had wooden idols, which pretty much everyone had. So there's some other odds and ends here that I'm going to give you. Another small detail that we get is that some of the Goths may have worshipped the Danube as a god itself and sacrificed victims to the river.
Wouldn't surprise me, though, because rivers are real, people used to see them as different, passageways to the other world, to the underworld, as liminal spaces, particularly ones that had caves. So it wouldn't surprise me if they actually believed that.
Another thing that we know about the Goths that is specific to the Goths is that they didn't bury their dead with weapons. Why is that? Why?
They hung them in the trees.
There are many reasons we could come up with. It could be a practical reason. Weapons were expensive, the metal to make them was not easily found, and a dead warrior's friends and family couldn't afford to just give up his weapons. Or perhaps there was a concept of an afterlife at work here where the warrior's fighting was done, kind of like the opposite of a Valhalla, right? We don't know what the religious belief could have been that led to this practice, but it is interesting to think that there might have been one.
Absolutely. In the epistle to the Colossians, the Apostle Paul mentions, quote, new moon celebrations as a tradition he opposes, up there with honoring the Sabbath and non-Christian religious festivals. Ulfilas translates this into Gothic as something different, that worship of the full moon should be forbidden. And this seems like a rather deliberate mistake, aimed at a specifically Gothic audience. Arguments have been made to suggest that the Goths had a moon cult based on this evidence, which would make a lot of sense. So many ancient cultures had moon cults. However, Herwig Wolfram argues that what this is probably a reference to is the Gothic practice of using a moon calendar to calculate when important feast days fell. It's clear that they had important feast days based on the account of Sabbaths, the Goth, and the sacrificial meat, and Tacitus tells us specifically that the Germanic peoples used moon calendars to mark their important council days, since they did not count time in days but in nights. It's really interesting, Jenny, because Easter, now how we calculate it, at least in the Catholic religion as far as I know, is that it has to be the first Sunday after the full moon on or after the spring equinox. So there's a moon calendar at play here too.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that that's a thing that Christians use to calculate their holidays, even though the Apostle Paul was very much against moon calendars. Potentially he was against it because it was a pagan practice, and this was, this is very early Christianity that was still figuring itself out. So that is more or less what we've got about Gothic religious practices prior to Christianity. We've got a polytheistic religion focused on maybe a male sky god, with a tradition based in ancestor worship that was extremely important to maintaining hierarchies even in small villages. Possible practices include auguries, blood rune magic, sigildry, important feasts based on the moon, sacred groves and sacred music, war music, human sacrifice, a sense of oaths, and a god that could kill at a touch, among other things. But the Goths converted to Christianity rather early in their history, and in the next episode, as far as I could tell, as of this recording, it's still the next episode, I'm going to talk about how that happened, and I am finally going to address Arian Christianity and what that meant, because I've been mentioning it a lot without explaining it, because it's a whole long thing, and I felt like it needed its own episode. So, that's it for this week. Join us next week for the next installment in this series. In the meantime, come find us on social on all the platforms at Ancient History Fangirl. We are most active on Instagram.
And join us on our Patreon. We are at patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl. As we say in every episode, it is the Patreon and our patrons who allow us to keep making this podcast and doing this research. Without them, this just would not be possible. It's a full-time job for each of us, and we don't make enough money through advertising and other things. So the Patreon is our lifeblood, and we appreciate all of our patrons. And this week, who do we have to thank, Jenny?
We have one patron to thank. Thank you so much to Gracie D. And if you would like to sign up to our Patreon, we have definitely had a drop-off in subscribers lately. Times are financially hard for everybody, but if you are in a place to give, definitely now is the time, and we really appreciate it. And you get extra episodes from us if you don't like it, that we're only bi-monthly now. We will return to weekly on the Patreon, where we release probably about an episode a week, really.
We release about an episode a week. They're ad-free, and the main feed episodes drop a day early.
That's right. So come on over there. It's a great time. And thank you all so much for your support, and thank you for listening. And we will see you whenever we see you next. Hey everyone, it's Jenny and Jen here, and as a special extra, we're giving you a section of the audiobook version of my novel, Enemy of My Dreams, narrated by Lisa Flanagan.
This is the section where Julia is introduced. Julia was not a real historical character. She's based on 3 different historical women who we've talked about a lot on the podcast. Julia the Elder, Augustus's daughter. Galla Placidia, who is probably the closest to Jenny's Julia historically. She was the real Honorius' sister. But personality-wise, she was very different from Jenny's Julia.
Yeah, I would say she's quite different, but there are similarities.
Oh, yeah. And of course, the third woman is the fantastic Honoria.
Yeah, so my Julia is kind of a hedonistic party girl when the book starts, but she also really grows into herself a lot in this novel, and hopefully in book 2, if I did my job right, without losing her ability to have fun. And I hope you enjoy this intro, and you can pick up the book or the audiobook wherever such things are sold.
Julia Augusta, daughter of the late Theodosius the Great, cracked an eye at the blazing, pernicious dawn shining through the window, and immediately shut it again. There had been opium in the wine last night. Julia knew both from the peachy glow that had transformed her triclinium into a gleaming wonderland, and the viciously pounding headache that was now pulverizing her skull. She had known what the Blue Lotus would do to her in the morning, and she hadn't cared. A grave miscalculation. She was lying on her bed, her head pillowed on the soft, breathing stomach of her best friend Verena, the niece of Rome's most illustrious general. Her limbs splayed across the torso of a senator's son. Several others slept tangled in the huge bed and on the cushion-strewn couches and on the floor. "Verena," she murmured. "Mm?" came the reply. Julia sat up. The sun streaming through the courtyard stabbed at her eyes. Even the water trickling in the impluvium fountain aggravated her pounding head. Her elegant bedroom was in extravagant disarray. Wine spilled on white marble, couches overturned, and cushions scattered in the wreckage of last night's bacchanal. All around lay the sleeping bodies of the young and decadent of Ravenna. Sons and daughters of senators and statesmen, philosophical luminaries and handsome stage actors, most in a state of undress that would appall their parents. A man in a satyr costume sprawled on a saffron couch, drooling into a silken cushion. The miasma of stale wine in the air was thick enough to intoxicate all over again. Julia pushed a hank of sweaty red hair out of her face and pulled a swath of near-transparent silk up over her breasts. It barely concealed her gilded nipples. The crown she had worn last night as Queen of the Maenads, mistress of revelries, was somehow still on her head, and decidedly askew. Beside her, Verena curled up around another cushion, pulling the same silk up over her own shoulders. It appeared to be a curtain yanked down from one of the windows. Images of last night came intruding on her thoughts. The music, the mad dancing, the opium in the wine. Julia shut her eyes. She needed a bath. A bath, then a drink. In that order. A shrill voice sliced through her skull. "Julia Theodosia Augusta Philia!" Julia winced. It was Olympius, her late father's favored minister, standing in the doorway. He wore his usual joyless cassock, his expression drawn into the sour frown of a man constantly smelling his own foul scent. "Dismiss your friends, Augusta." His gaze flicked over the piles of half-naked slumbering bodies with bone-deep disgust. "You and I must talk." Julia sighed heavily. She had known this was coming. "You heard the man," she said grandly to the still slumbering group. Slowly, her friends hauled themselves up and stumbled around for their clothes. Verena righted herself reluctantly with a look of supreme annoyance at Olympius. "I'll find you later," Verena whispered, "after you've had his blood cleaned off the floor." Julia smirked. At a signal from her, an army of soft-footed servants entered and began discreetly putting the room to rights. Julia maintained an air of casual unconcern, watching the blotchy red spread from the man's face to his neck. By the time the group had thinned out, she was fairly certain Olympius would burst a vessel. "I hardly expected to find you so improperly dressed this late in the day." Julia stood with as much dignity as she could muster, wrapping a robe around herself as if it were an empress's gown. She was very aware of what he saw. Her red hair trailing down her back, the smeared black kohl ringing her eyes, the gilded nipples under the silk. But the way his face flamed, she rather thought he was at the disadvantage. Since the age of 15, she'd been aware of the effect she had on men. She was not above using it to make an uptight zealot uncomfortable. And she would walk over hot coals before she would let Olympius think he had any power to discomfit her. Julia had been playing this game for a long time, and the first rule was to never let him see her rattled. Despite the vicious pounding in her head, she maintained an air of casual ease as she sauntered over to one of the couches. On the contrary, receiving guests in this manner is all the fashion now. Of course, one wouldn't expect you to know that, went unsaid. She gave him a cutting smile. With Olympius, she kept everything transparent and sharp as glass. "Please, She gestured to the lumpiest sofa, the one the satyr had been drooling on. Sit. Olympias settled onto the saffron-yellow sofa. He'd gotten thin since her father's death, his already lean features edging toward gaunt. His eyes had always bulged. Now they seemed to fairly pop out of his face. Her chamber slave, Agatha, arrived with a pitcher of the low-quality wine from the Vatican Hill that had been foisted upon her last week. It flowed red into Olympias's cup. You were missed last night at the Mass for your father. I spent 40 nights at vigil. 40 nights bending knee to stone in the dusty basilica. She'd die if they made her do it for one more miserable hour. I cannot imagine what else you want from me. It is not what I want from you, Augusta. It is what is best for the realm. His frown deepened. When your brother ordered you to keep to your rooms when not in the basilica, he meant for you to be at prayer with your women, not involved in clandestine orgies with Ravenna's most degenerate. By now everyone will know that last night, instead of attending the Mass for your father, you hosted a party at which there was opium, prostitutes, men dressed as satyrs, and the lowest kind of debauchery. Julia let out an elaborate sigh. How could the headache throb so hard behind only one eye? There was only one satyr, if you must know. His gaze, she noticed, had drifted distinctly south of her neck. She raised a cool brow. Does it keep you up at night, Olympias, contemplating my debauchery? His face darkened to purple. Since your father's death, you have embarked in a headlong descent into depravity, he said stiffly. Spending time with people below your station, reading and discussing the works of philosophers with men. You take opium, become inebriated, and have had at least one very public affair. He drew a swath of parchment out of his robes and rattled it in his hand. Your brother has entrusted me to give you this. Fear and fury shot through her. Honorius. Give me that. Julia snatched the letter and unrolled it with undue haste. 2 words stood out like they'd been excised in gold leaf. Treason and exile. Read it, Olympias said. Aloud. Julia drew a breath. It is hereby decreed that any exhibition of debauchery, consumption of wine, fraternization with those below her social class, reading of unseemly tracts of literature, or the ingestion of opium on the part of the Emperor's sister, shall be considered an act of treason against the Augustus himself. The paper crinkled where she gripped it. Punishable by exile to Pandateria. Her eyes darted to the bottom of the page. She knew she would see it there, but she still felt its presence like a physical blow. Her brother's seal.
Monster Energy. Everybody knows White Monster, Zero Ultra. That's the OG. It kicked off this whole zero sugar energy drink thing. But Ultra is a whole lineup now. You've got Strawberry Dreams, Blue Hawaiian, Sunrise, and Vice Guava. And they all bring the Monster Energy punch. So if you've been living in the white can, branch out. Ultra's got a flavor for every vibe. And every single one is zero sugar. Tap the banner to learn more.